Land. For more than 400 years of Westover family history, land has been central to the feelings, the pursuits, and the values of each passing generation. For the 16th and 17th century Westovers of southwest England, land was a battleground. Land and one's association with it would shape how society classed an individual and even a family. Land was not something one owned. It was where what you owned and what you believed were fought for. The children and grandchildren of Gabriel Westover were sent to a new world, a place where land meant something different, something more. The generations of Jonas Jr., Jonathan, and John Westover worked the land with great hope, building, expanding, and freely exercising faith in ways their forefathers never could. But there were battles yet to fight over the land. The many sons of John Westover, those with the biblical names who survived the American Revolution, turned to the land after a hard-fought peace, victors in the sense that freedom could truly at last be defined by their efforts on the land. They were spread out in nearly every direction, seeking opportunities that land in their own names would provide. For the wandering generations of future Westovers, Amos, Alexander, and Edwin Westover, the landscape changed frequently, and they were subject to its dangers. There was a place for them out there somewhere, and in it at last the Westover family could take root. That brings us to the children of our pioneering ancestors, a generation that would later be known as the authors of the Industrial Revolution and founders of the 20th century. This is William Ruth Van Westover, one of those pioneer children. Take a good look at his face. It comes from one of the few surviving images of him. The lines on his face and the expression in his eyes cannot tell you all that he thought and all that he was. This picture, and just a few other details, are all that we have of his history. In fact, we know less about him as a man than most of his forefathers. Despite this, the ironic truth today is that William is the patriarchal figurehead of the modern Westover family. How did that happen? It happened because of land, the one common denominator between him and every generation of Westovers that came before him. For William, his land was the final frontier, the last pioneering effort of the family, and William knew it would outlast him. He knew the land he left behind would become home. William Westover, the first son of Edwin and Ann Westover, would know a lot of changes early on in his life. Born in Minden just before his parents left to pioneer in southern Utah, little white-haired Willie, as Grandma Electa Westover liked to call him, would return to Minden at 8 years of age. Around the time that Ann Finley Westover would bring her family to Minden to stay, another family by the name of Rowe was also moving in. William Rowe and his wife Elizabeth temporarily moved in with William's little brother Manning, who was one of the founders of the town of Minden. The Rowes would purchase 30 acres of farmland occupying the steeper hillside west of town, and there William Rowe would make a name for himself for being able to get water to all 30 acres and producing significant crops on his hillside farm. The fourth child of William and Elizabeth was a daughter named Ruth, who with her siblings helped her father to produce potatoes, vegetables, and wheat on the family farm. Ruth was dependable, cheerful, and friendly, and she became friends with young William Westover, who was only 6 months older. Ward records show William and Ruth attended ward functions in the 1870s, and given Ann Finley Westover's place in the community, both as a primary leader and as a friend to children in town, it is safe to assume that Ruth spent a lot of time in the Westover home. Ann's circumstances would require a lot of young Willie. Gone was his uncle and namesake, William Finley Jr., and growing older and more feeble after years of coal mining and farming was Grandpa William Finley Sr. Willie, alongside big sister Emma, would be called to work as much of the two family farms as he could handle. In some ways, William's upbringing was much like his own father's. His grandfather Alexander was taken at a young age, and William's father Edwin learned to work hard early in life. Though Edwin lived long beyond Willie's boyhood years, they never worked the farm together. William Westover would learn to work from his grandfather and from the men of neighboring families, men like William Rowe. who would contribute time, equipment, and sometimes resources to help single mother families who were either widowed or in plural wife arrangements. Minden only had about 500 residents in the 1870s. Families knew each other well, and they knew each other's business. They pulled together, and they frequently entered into family, farm, or financial arrangements in order to survive. Anne took up residence with her brother's widow, Aunt Sarah, as Willie and the others called her. His best friend would be his cousin, Sarah's boy James, who was 5 years older. These blended large families would have to work together as Anne took a job with the local store. For young William, the work was real, and he would rarely know a day similar to those in families like the Rose, whose father was working the land with the family. While William was the man of the house for Anne, he was as engaged as anyone in the community. In 1871, an event happened that would affect William deeply. His cousin James, who was his co-worker on the family farms, drowned in the Bear River at a place now named in his honor called Finley's Bend. These events were part of the realities of pioneer living. Things often changed quickly, and tragedies had to be endured. As the Westover children entered into their mid to late teen years, the changes would be swift and permanent. Eldest child Emma, in 1876 at the age of 18, became wife to Walter Paul, son of a prominent pioneer family who had recently moved to Minden. Walter Paul was the son of William Paul, a skilled carpenter who immigrated to Salt Lake from England in 1854. Upon moving to Utah, the family formed a company called William Paul and Sons, and they became known for building some of the finest furniture in Salt Lake City. They furnished many of the stately homes found on South Temple, including the Devereaux House, a fine Victorian mansion frequently used by Brigham Young to entertain large groups and distinguished visitors. Walter Paul brought his furniture-making skills with him, along with his large family of 7 children, to Cache Valley, opening up a furniture store in Logan in the late 1860s. During these prosperous times, the Pauls suffered some hardships during a cold winter that ended up costing the life of Walter's first wife. She died in January of 1875. A little more than a year later, in the spring of 1876, Walter married young Emma Westover, who was just 9 months older than Walter's oldest daughter, who was, in fact, her dear friend. The Paul family history would thus merge with the Westover family history in a strong way moving forward, as was common for many people living in Utah's small rural communities. Love was also in the air for young William Westover, who by this time was approaching 16 years of age. His many years of association with Ruth Rowe would blossom into love as they both contemplated the future. Their romance began in 1876 and would continue for 7 long years as William dutifully worked the farm and provided for his mother and his younger siblings and cousins. Even by today's standards, 7 years is a long courtship. For that day and age, it was almost unheard of. But by 1883, William and Ruth were finally married. By the end of 1883, William and Ruth were parents, welcoming their first child, William Ernest, on December 27th. The following spring, they moved for a brief period of time to Cabin, Idaho. They stayed there for 2 years until just before their second child, Arthur Edwin, was born. Deep beneath the crust of the earth, under an area west of modern-day Yellowstone, remains one of the most active volcanic plains on Earth. Over the course of hundreds of millions of years, this bubbling subterranean cauldron has shaped and reshaped the Earth's surface, changing it from a landscape once covered with ocean to wide-open volcanic plains, creating a land rich in nutrients. However, its high elevation, marked by mountain vistas, freshwater mountain lakes, and snow-swept open fields, made for a land famous to natives and immigrants alike for bitter cold winters and only mild summers. For 19th century settlers looking north from Utah, the joke was that the area had 9 months of winter and 3 months of late fall. Not many believed the area could be colonized because of the uncertainty of whether or not crops could grow. By the late 1870s, a railroad line had crept north from Utah to a place called Eagle Rock in Idaho Territory. That area would later come to be called Idaho Falls. That accessibility piqued the curiosity of one William B. Preston, a Mormon stake president from Cache Valley. Although senior church leadership through Brigham Young had declared interest in the area years before, Preston acted on his own in calling a handful of men from Logan, Utah, to explore and settle this windswept place of ancient volcanic rock. Leading the group was Thomas Ricks, and over the course of the next few years, he would come to settle the area later to be known as Rexburg, the name Rex being the German form of his last name Rix. Rexburg was an unusual name, and folks outside of the area had a hard time with it. But for local settlers, the area was more commonly known as Mosquito Flats, because the area was thick with them. It was a place that was raw, covered in sage, and prone to winter temperatures that would fall consistently below zero. Like Mendon to the south, it was well traveled by Indians. Like Salt Lake further in Utah, it could at times be overrun by outlaws and miners who would frequently pass through the area. And like the Mormon settlements in southern Utah near St. George, it could be an unrelentingly cruel climate, one that occasionally proved deadly to those souls who tried to live there. For William Westover, descendant of Puritans, Pilgrims, pioneers, and saints, it represented everything they lived and died for, and something more. For William, it represented not a family past, but a family future. William knew that as the industrial age expanded and the great experiment known as America grew, his children and their children would be generations that would define America's greatness and fulfill her promise. The blessings of liberty would truly be theirs if he could survive the land and make it a home, a lasting legacy to the Westover name. One of the first families joining the rush to settle Rexburg was the Walter and Emma Westover Paul family, who moved there in 1884. With a partner, Walter opened a furniture store in Rexburg and staked a claim north of town. He was a president of the 84th Quorum of the 70, the first justice of the peace of Rexburg, and he founded the first theatrical society there. Given his skills as a carpenter, he also became the coroner, because he could supply the caskets. Their years in Rexburg were marked by the expansion of their family, and all more than 11 children would be added to Walter and Emma Westover Paul. Families during this time remained closely associated. Emma and William Westover's little sister Mary Ellen married Walter's brother Edmund around the same time that Emma married Walter. Like his brother, Edmund was a talented Finnish carpenter. Together, these two brothers, who married the Westover girls, moved to Rexburg. So by the end of the decade of the 1880s, there were plenty of Westovers and Pauls now located in Rexburg. Perhaps this was a consideration for William and Ruth, who with their young family still looking for a place to stake a claim, moved there as well. Most settlers of this time took advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862. Federal legislation allowed for the free transfer of up to 160 acres of land if a petitioner could stay on the land and develop it for a period of 5 years. Due to Walter Paul's many roles in the community, he could not develop his 160 acres himself, so he quartered his claim, meaning he divided the land into equal parts so it could be developed by others. For William Westover, he saw opportunity in the raw landscape, and he took a quarter claim from Walter Paul's property and built a small cabin with a sod roof there in 1890. Doing so would result in a smaller claim for himself, but it would satisfy the federal requirements to secure title to the land from the government. Why William and Walter chose this course of action in relation to a family farm is lost to history. Perhaps it was the proximity of the location to Rexburg and to other family members. But in so doing, William's financial fate was tied to that of Walter Paul, a fact that would complicate matters for them both in the years ahead. Regardless, it was here that William and Ruth would grow their family and their future. Floyd was born in 1888, followed by Ray in 1890. A daughter, little Hazel Ann, was born in 1893. Mosquito Flats was no simple claim. The early settlers of Rexburg really suffered from their isolation, their poverty, and from the climate. Conditions were very primitive, and for the first few years the Westover family could barely produce what they could consume. What may have been unknown to the family at the time were the diseases that mosquitoes could carry. Yellow fever was common. In 1893, diphtheria swept through the area, affecting dozens of families and eventually taking the lives of more than 70 children in Rexburg before it had run its course. In 1895, it was measles. That, coupled with the bitter winter, where temperatures were recorded as low as 38 degrees below zero, kept people inside, and many of them were sick. For the Westovers, tragedy struck in February 1895, when 2-year-old Hazel Ann was stricken and died. It was only a month later that her little brother, Arnold, was born. Amidst all the sickness and the primitive conditions, it is important to note that the country at large was experiencing a financial depression during these early years in Rexburg of the 1890s. For Walter Paul, whose many activities not only stretched his time, conditions made it difficult for him to stay afloat financially. Rexburg city records show that Paul and other area merchants generously extended credit to strapped local farmers, and they in turn struggled. Walter's financial problems were part of the reason why William and Ruth came to Rexburg to work a quarter of his claim. Walter simply couldn't fulfill the requirements to develop his land, given his other responsibilities in the community and the thinly stretched resources that he had left. He frankly needed William to produce. Newspaper records from 1893 and 1894 show that Walter and his partner in the furniture store business in downtown Rexburg filed for bankruptcy. Life continued to be rough for everyone. The mosquitoes continued to harass settlers so famously that many histories report that meals were eaten with a fork in one hand and the other was left to fight off the bugs. For Walter and Emma Westover Paul, their losses continued to mount. In 1897, while giving birth to her 11th child, Emma passed away, leaving Walter a widower once again. From Rexburg to Minden, both the Paul and Westover families rallied to help them. For William, the complicated paperwork, court cases, and financial disarray of Walter Paul's businesses prevented him from completing his claim. For more than a decade, his case languished in the courts, hopelessly tied to the fortunes of Walter Paul, who struggled with his own situation. With the passing of William's big sister Emma, Walter Paul found it impossible to continue as they had been living. His younger children were divided up among other family members, including young Elmer and Lavina, who went to Minden to live for a time with William and Emma's mother Anne. Walter not only separated his family, he also liquidated many of his assets, including another quarter claim close to William that he donated to the city of Rexburg to become the community cemetery. It was only after this transaction was settled that the claim of William Westover could move forward. It took some time, but William eventually qualified for his own homestead claim under his own name. He only had to put in yet another 5 years on the property he had already spent several years developing. By the late 1890s, fuller crops were coming, and a bigger home had been built for his family. But the land was not free and clear, and it became no small matter of anxiety to William. Still, the family continued to grow. Zena was born in 1897, then Myrtle in 1899, and finally Lauren came along in 1902. Through it all, William and Ruth worked side by side, day and night, in support of their claim, their children, and their hopes for the future. It was difficult, and they suffered from the slow progress, even to the point of depression. They were faithful in the church, however, and taught their children the principles they themselves had been taught as children of pioneers. In 1902, William began to suffer from ill health, and after a diagnosis of stomach cancer and a failed surgery, William died in October of 1903. His loss could not have been more devastating for Ruth. There she was with 8 children, ages 1 to 20, with a struggling farm to manage. Her history claims the strain of it all was too much for Ruth, and for the next 10 years she struggled before she succumbed in 1914. The children of William and Ruth were left to fend for themselves, but as they had for other family members in distress, the extended family, the church, and the community nearby jumped into action to support the Westover children. Older married children stayed on the farm, and those who moved away took younger siblings into their homes. William and Ruth did not live to see their family survive or succeed, but in the years not long after they passed, the family farm became the gathering place that William hoped it would be. There, memories made without William and Ruth would be born of love for them and what they taught and what they represented. Though it has seen many come and go, the Westover Ranch has survived into the 21st century as a legacy project by descendants of William and Ruth Westover. Each summer, family branches gather on the land that for so long required so much sacrifice from William and Ruth.